The last two federal leaders' debates took place this week, the English debate and the second French debate. Did they change the conversation or the race? Let's ask Erin Kelly. She's CEO of Advanced Symbolics Inc., the pollster with Polly, the artificial intelligence algorithm that's watching this all very closely. Welcome back, Erin.
Hello, Nam.
Usually you're speaking to Steve, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you. So it's 10 days out now from the election. What is Polly seeing about where each of the parties are standing at this point in the campaign?
So at this point in the campaign, nothing is changing much. So we had two debates this week. We still see the Liberals on the cusp of a majority government right now in minority territory. We see seats going back and forth a little bit in the regions, but they're canceling each other out.
In what ways?
Well, so we'll see, for example, more seats being won by the Liberals in Atlantic Canada and then coming down in Quebec. And so nationally, it ends up being just a difference of one or two seats.
Well, speaking of Quebec, last night was the French debate. Any changes after that?
Well, it was interesting. Last night, the discussion that we saw happening online was mostly about the policies and the leaders and their contradictory comments on just about every policy issue.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, so the biggest one last night was pipelines. So a lot of discussion last night about Mr. Trudeau bringing in a carbon tax and also buying a pipeline. That got through loud and clear to people. There was on Bill 21, which was really interesting. We didn't see anybody really talking about Bill 21 leading up to the debate. But after the debate, people kept talking about it. But they weren't talking about Bill 21. They were talking about how the leaders were contradicting themselves on Bill 21. So you had Mr. Trudeau saying, I am not going to do anything about Bill 21 right now, but I might later. Mr. Singh, the moderator, asked him very clearly, and now Mr. Singh came out very strongly in the English debate. Last night, there was a lot more criticism because, again, the moderator said, well, in the English debate, you said you would intervene for Bill 21. And he said, I didn't say that. And people went kind of crazy on social media saying, yes, he did. And they were pointing out when he did.
It's very interesting because for leaders, I guess it would just benefit them more to just take one stance and stick with it, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's where we saw, it was interesting, in both the English and the French debates, we saw high engagement on Mr. Bernier, so the leader of the People's Party of Canada. So now Mr. Bernier he's not going to get a lot of seats. It didn't make a difference in the seat count, but we saw a lot of people talking last night. At least he's honest. At least he tells you what he really thinks. We saw that last night, even when he said unpopular things, like with climate change, is very polarizing. But people said at least he is honest. And
there was an interesting moment last night. We have a graph to get to, but there was an interesting moment last night where all the other party leaders promised to help seniors. And then he looked at this older woman and said, actually, I'm not going to do anything because I can't promise anything because I want to do this before I do that.
Exactly.
And that honesty resonated with voters?
It did. In fact, during that whole exchange with that woman who is a widow or is a pensioner, that was won by Mr. Bernier because all the other leaders said, yes, yes, we'll help you, we'll help you. He was the only one who said, look, I can't help you.
Well, let's take a look at the graph for the French debate and the increase in people engaged in leader after debate. Can you walk us through this, please?
Yes, so the French debate last night, we saw almost all of the biggest lift was for Mr. Blanchette, obviously because there are a lot of people watching from the Bloc Québécois, but they also liked a lot of the things that he said, which we can talk about. But look at that, Mr. Bernier is the second most talked about person, and not because of his controversial stances, but because of the honest things that he said last night.
And who does that hurt?
It hurt Mr. Trudeau. So you see in the graph, the lowest engagement was on the two front runners, on Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Scheer. So that's why and I'm seeing this as a theme through all of the debates, that people are seeing contradictions. It started with abortion, again, not an issue in Canada. People aren't talking about abortion, but they started talking about it when Mr. Scheer hedged in that first debate, where he refused to say what his personal views are. Now he's willing to say what they are, but anytime a leader is hedging or is saying two different things in two different debates, or saying, I'm not going to do anything now, but I might later, it causes people to react very negatively. And if the leaders think that they're fooling people, they're really not. We're seeing it come very clearly in the conversations that are happening when people are watching it, that they're noticing these contradictions.
And of course, earlier this week was also the English debate. And let's take a look at the increase in people engaged in the leader after that debate. What did we see after Monday night?
Again, you see the leader that people thought was the most honest and forthcoming and sincere, Mr. Singh. He came off very well in that debate. And again, it was because of his sincerity. People were talking about that he felt like he spoke from the heart. His highlights were when he actually challenged Mr. Bernier, when Mr. Bernier said, you don't believe in a diversity of ideas, and when he talked about growing up as a visible minority in Bill 21. So he came out very strongly in that one. Of course, that then hurt him last night in the French debate.
And what does that hurt with Mr. Singh doing better?
Well, it was interesting. So, you know, and it's the law of unintended consequences, right? So we saw that Mr. Singh, with his strong performance in the English debate, actually ended up pulling some left-leaning liberals, and that didn't help. That didn't give enough lift to Mr. Singh, so it ended up lifting conservative seats in some ridings.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And obviously the debate formats were very different. The debate format from Monday seemed to have it created a lot of conversation online and with pundits. How is that different from last night's debate?
So it's funny, quite a few of the people who watched last night's debate actually watched the English debate as well, and there was a lot of commentary on a lot of kudos to Patrice Roy, who was the moderator, that he did a great job, that he allowed leaders, when their time was going over, to finish their thought. And when there was an interesting conversation, he allowed it to continue while still respecting the time, more or less, whereas in the English debate, everybody was cut off. It was very frustrating because the audience is actually interested in the policies. They're really interested, and they're interested to see the sort of the two-facedness is what we were seeing last night. And so when that was being raised, Mr. Roy allowed those conversations to happen, is what people said, and they liked the face-offs, and they just felt it was a much more interesting format.
We've talked a little bit about Bill 21, and a lot of time was spent in both debates and the post-debate scrums as well. What are people saying about it now?
Again, they're saying really what's bothering people is that they don't understand what the leaders' positions are on it. Now, they understand Mr. Blanchet's position, which is why you see he got a lot of praise. They don't understand the position of Mr. Singh, Mr. Scheer, Mr. Trudeau, because there was a lot of talk last night that they are not consistent in what they believe. And it's not actually a problem because I think Quebecers are pretty confident that the Quebec government is going to defend this bill. What they're concerned about is the contradictions in the leaders, and can I trust you? Because trust is becoming a major issue in this election, much more so than in other elections that we've seen.
And a person that prides themselves in saying it as it is Maxime Bernier, the People's Party leader. And this week was the first time that he was on stage with the other leaders. Frank Graves, president and founder of Ecos Research Associates, tweeted this: "One of the surprising things we will show on Friday, which is today, barring radical shifts, is that the PPC is doing better after debate and with surprising groups, millennials and university educated. While not a major force, they are cannibalizing CPC support, something to watch." What's Polly finding about Bernier's support following the debate?
So important to note, because Polly is looking at seat counts as well as popular vote. So the first thing I need to say is he is not stealing seats in a significant way from other parties. We see him as getting between 0 and 1 seat. He's
not even from the Conservatives.
No, because he's not. We talk about efficiency of seat distribution. His seat count is not efficient at all. So yes, we saw last night, and you saw that, yes, from a popular point of view, you saw engagement on him was high because people really liked his honesty. Another big moment for him last night was when he said these leaders are promising to balance the deficit in 5 years, and they've only got a 4-year mandate. People love that. Now, people aren't that interested in the deficit, to be honest. It's not something we've seen them talk about, but they loved that he pointed out that hypocrisy, and that is very popular among young voters. So
because
there's no doubt.
The implication is that you would have to get me back
Exactly.
for another term to finish.
And I can stand up in 4 years and say, well, I only promised to balance it in 5, so I haven't broken my promise. But that's very insincere. So that's why we are seeing that people like that and they appreciate that, but he is not winning more seats because of it.
Okay. And so Andrew Scheer doesn't have anything to worry about?
Not right now. Not from him. He has to worry about the fact that he's in second place.
Where are the tightest races in this province?
In Ontario, the tightest. So we've got some tight races. There's a tight race in the tightest races are in the 905. Ottawa's pretty much baked. We've got one riding where it's still contentious. 905 is where the biggest swings are happening. Mostly Liberal Conservative, but also some involving the NDP.
10 days left until the election, and this weekend is advanced polling. It starts. How close is Polly calling the race now?
So Polly is fairly certain at this point that barring any big gotchas, that the Liberals are going to win. The Liberals are on the cusp of a majority government, so it's still too close to call whether it'll be a minority or a majority. There's kind of a wide window, and the reason for that wide window is because, again, the weakness of Mr. Trudeau is the two-sidedness that people are talking about. So that makes Polly a bit nervous in terms of will they swing at the last minute. But it's been pretty consistent now that because all of the leaders have this issue, that it's looking like a Liberal.
And there's also been a lot of rumors in the news lately with Mr. Trudeau and also in the past few days with Mr. Scheer. Does Polly see any of that changing people's perceptions of who they're going to be voting for?
Polly is definitely seeing it enter the vernacular, so people are talking about it, they know about it, about these different rumors. It is not affecting, so it's interesting, people are saying, I haven't seen it substantiated, people want to, they're not willing to go, we've had a lot of talk about does fake news affect people. This is interesting because this could be seen as an example of that, where people are saying if it's not substantiated, if it's just rumors, we are not seeing it affect the seat count.
How close is Polly calling whether it's going to be a minority government?
Right now, that's the most likely scenario, but there's still a sizable probability of a majority government. So it's too early to tell. But we have advanced polls coming up this weekend. If we see, two things will be interesting to see, how many people show up to the advanced polls. And often if we get quite a few people showing up, they're a good indicator of how things are going to go in the future, and people will talk about how they voted.
Can Polly see whether people, if the next 10 days will affect their vote, or do people essentially have an idea of who they're going to cast their vote for?
For a lot of people, it appears to be baked. But because it's a long weekend and there's the advanced polls, we definitely want to wait and see how things play out. So we'll have a much better idea next week. I think we'll be in a good position to call it on Friday.
Erin, thank you so much for coming in. It's always so much fun having you in here, and the audience really loves your insights, and Polly's insights, of course.
Thanks,
we'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Thanks.
Bye.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.